Continuing our reading in Yellow Eyes by Rutherford Montgomery. Today is Chapter 9, The White Spectre. The snows continued all through that month, and never packed or hardened. Hunger, that grim spectre of the white wilderness, sat with Yellow Eyes in his cave for 2 weeks. Game was not to be had, and the young cat grew gaunt and grim. He did not play in the snow after leaving his cave, but hunted steadily and desperately. One night, as he was returning to his lodge just at dusk, empty-bellied and weak from 2 days of fasting, with only a rabbit as provender during those 3 days, just before his last meal, he heard a soft call, commanding, yet pleading, drift softly down the wind. For a moment he hesitated, rigid and eager, thinking it the call of his mother, whom he sorely needed in his hunger. As he listened, he realized it was the Indian Trian calling from the trail below. He shook his head and growled softly. With a sudden release of pent-up longing and weariness, he answered. His call hurled down the wind, long drawn and lonesome in its weird cadence. It was answered, and Yellow Eyes faced about. He padded along slowly, watchful and wary. When he reached the spot from which the call had come, he saw no one, but he found the trail of snowshoes in a drift. The trail had come up to the ridge and turned back. Yellow Eyes sniffed at the scent of the buckskin hide thongs, which bound the shoes together. He nosed about and suddenly leaped back. A carcass, freshly skinned, lay on a bare rock. It was the carcass of a beaver Trian had caught. The Indian had a permit to trap beaver for their pelts. After taking the hide, he had thought of Chimbika, whom he knew was hungry to the point of starvation. Yellow Eyes sniffed eagerly but warily at the meat. His jaws dripped hungrily as he edged toward it. Suddenly, he set his teeth into it and jerked it from the rock. He leaped upon it and tore at it savagely. Intently, he gulped down the tender flesh until he had eaten all of the carcass except the bigger bones. Sitting in the snow, he washed his face and licked his lips. A deep, rumbling purr rose in his throat, and his amber eyes stared down the snowshoe trail. Presently, he got up and padded along that trail. Darkness had settled over the white world, and the air was cold and brittle. He came to the clearing where Trian's cabin stood and sat down on a drift. A light reddened the cabin window, and a thin wisp of smoke lifted straight up toward the chill stars. He sat there unmoving and silent until the light in the window winked out, before he lifted his black whiskers to the North Star and screamed long and loud. Inside the cabin, Trian was curled up under his blankets, half asleep. He roused himself and raised upon one elbow. A wide smile parted his lips. Chimbika is pleased, he said softly, and rolled up in his blankets again. Several days later, Yellow Eyes made an important discovery. He had traveled lower down the ridge that day and learned that the deer were below him in the aspen belt. He found elk, too, yarded in several aspen groves or willow patches. Twice he attacked deer, feeding on the windward swept ridges, but soon discovered that he was no match for an agile creature in the soft snow. But the discovery showed him where to hunt, and he pursued the deer every day. He stalked them with a patience that was his heritage. Lying in the snow for hours, he watched, hoping one of them would grow unwary and approach cover close enough for him to spring upon it. However, the deer who had remained in the high country were strong fellows whose maturity was the result of wary and watchful living. Not a single buck fed within the danger zone. Hunger began to drive Yellow Eyes to desperation again. He turned his attention to the yarded elk. Those big fellows looked beyond the power of a hunter of his size. Most of them were armed with a sweeping spread of sharp antlers. Hours of crawling and watching revealed a young bull yarded in a patch of willows a few rods from a main yard containing 2 bulls and 3 cows. Yellow Eyes crept upon the young bull from the windward. He approached slowly and spent a full hour in maneuvering to his position close beside the yellow willow patch. Carefully selecting a spot where his lance-like claws would find a hold on the frozen ground, he flattened his head and waited. The young bull turned his back and began stripping bark from a willow. Yellow Eyes tensed himself and pulled his legs under him. With a scream, he launched his golden body over the willows. He landed squarely upon the back of the young bull, his great hind legs, feet slashing at the flanks, while his front paws clutched at the shoulders. His bared teeth sank into the neck of the bull. With a whistling scream, the bull plunged out of the willow yard straight for the big clearing. The bulls in the clearing answered the cry for help by whirling about and planting their feet firmly. The cows cowered at the edge of the snow-packed space. Yellow Eyes clung to his victim and slashed with his teeth viciously. The young bull hurled himself between the 2 big fellows. He shook his head and staggered against one of the bulls. The head of the big bull swept sideways with a terrific thrust of bone lances. The sharp antlers caught Yellow Eyes in the side and hurled him from the back of the young bull. He fell screaming and lashing under the hooves of the second big bull. The 4 feet of an elk are more formidable weapons than his horns, and this bull knew how to use them. He reared back and lashed downward at the squirming cat. Yellow Eyes was slashed on the shoulder and across the neck before he could roll free of the slashing hooves. With a defiant snarl, he leaped clear of the willow hedge and floundered away through the new snow. Weak and sore, he padded upward. His gaunt sides heaved, and he snarled as he went. He had tasted combat with the biggest of the wild dwellers. A strange fire was burning within him. He would not forget, and one day he would avenge his defeat. That night he lay and licked his wounds and snarled softly. The pain in his contracted stomach was as great as the hurt from his slashes. Together they kept him awake, and he got but a few hours of fitful sleep. The next day he would kill and gorge himself. That was his only thought as he lay and rested. But the next morning he did not make a kill, though he traveled far and stalked several bucks. In desperation he charged the wary mule deer whenever he saw one feeding. The result was always the same. The buck would leap away before his charge, lifting his slender hooves above the soft snow and leaping ahead as though nothing obstructed his flight. The loose snow reduced Yellow Eyes' leaps and slowed his progress. The glare of the morning sun drove him to shelter, hungry and surly. He lay in a spruce thicket and watched the slope below. He was learning one of the stern lessons of the wild, the harsh truth that existence must be fought for, that many long fasting periods must be endured. As the day wore on, a thaw descended upon the frozen slopes. The air grew almost balmy, and a gentle breeze blew up from the valleys below, warm and caressing. The rise in temperature irritated Yellow Eyes and made him restless, but he did not leave his thicket. By sundown, the snow was soggy on the surface with water. With the setting of the sun, snapping cold again settled over the woods and meadows. The surface of the snow froze to a hard crust. Yellow Eyes found when he slipped from the thicket that he could walk on the surface in most places. Avoiding spots where spruce and balsam had shaded the snow and kept it from softening, he could run on the glazed surface. He padded along aimlessly. He was still hunting, but so weakly and dispiritedly that he lacked alertness. The gnawing pain within him demanded food, but his tired muscles refused to give him action. He wandered down to the windswept ridge where he knew the deer would be feeding. Pausing behind a thicket of adder, he watched a big buck champing frozen grass on a narrow space of bare ground between the deep snow of the rim and the drifts piled in the underbrush below. A fury of starving desire swept over him. The buck was alert and constantly on the watch, and he was beyond the reach of the cougar unless he waited for the cat to make at least 4 leaps. Yellow Eyes tossed aside caution and patience. Out there beyond his reach was food. He bounded through the adder stand and leapt ahead, his claws sinking into the frozen earth. At the first bound of the young cougar, the buck was off, bounding down the slope at a swift pace, his head laid back and his nostrils flaring. Yellow Eyes bounded after him, his leaps covering 20 feet at a thrust. The buck struck the glazed snow, and his sharp hooves cut through. He almost stumbled, but was up instantly and leaping. Again his hooves cut through the crust, and he was almost tripped into a fall. Yellow Eyes struck the glazed snow and began to lope at a high speed. His wide pads did not break through. The buck made a gallant attempt to escape, but he was handicapped by the crusted snow and floundered instead of leaping away cleanly. Yellow Eyes descended upon him and leaped straight at his struggling back. Fangs closed while claws lashed. The buck went down, threshing and fighting. Yellow Eyes sank his fangs deeper and deeper until they found a vital spot, and the buck collapsed. The young cat had made his first kill of an antlered and full-grown buck. He had also learned that the laws of nature work for the killer as well as against him. The day's thaw was an evil thing for the deer, but it saved the young cat from starvation. No longer need he climb up to his cave hungry and wary after a fruitless hunt. His kills were assured him by the crusted snow, and he lived well and largely. His taste was for fresh meat and warm blood, so he killed each time he was hungry. Below every wind-swept feeding ground could be found evidence of his prowess and of his ruthless desire for hot blood. Partially eaten carcasses of deer furnished food for the fox and the stray coyote, and even for the lobo wolf who ranged these ridges. One evening, a month after the thaw, 5 sportsmen crossed the ridge on a ski trip. They noted the evidences of slaughter and angrily reproached Cougar George, the human, that night when they stopped at his cabin. The leader, Mr. Sale, a wealthy sportsman from a valley town, pounded on Cougar George's hem tabletop and shouted, "Your job is to get that fellow. He will spoil our hunting next fall. He has already killed 24 bucks. The shooting will be poor in your territory if you let him. Keep this up." Cougar George's weathered seam face worked into a scowl. "I'll get him. If it hadn't been for that thaw back a ways, he'd have been starved out by now." "I'll give $500 for his hide," the sportsman thundered, warm from the gin he had been drinking. The ridges Yellow Eyes were working were part of his territory, to which the sportsman brought his eastern friends each fall. "Oh, and I'll collect, by gall. Mark it down, and don't rub it out," Cougar George answered with a swagger. "I got the sweetest pack of dogs you ever set eyes on. We met an Indian up there and tried to hire him to kill the cat, but he just laughed at us. Funny critters, those people. He said something about it being the same to the buck whether a cat killed him or a hunter got gut shot him and let him die on the rocks to die." Oh, the sportsman emptied his tin cup of gin and wiped his mouth. That man, Treon, he ain't got much sense," Cougar George agreed. And that's the end of chapter 9.